Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at a couple of Airfix Class 31 engines, although this one is in the incorrect box, and we're going to see if we can digitalise these and restore them to running order. These were picked up relatively cheaply for about £15 to £20 each, and I'm going to start by looking at this BR Green version, which has been named the Silcock Express. Now, it may look pretty basic on the outset, but I actually like these very much. There is quite a lot of detail in them, although they are ripe for an upgrade, and they are a perfect budget model. They are also very easy to convert to DCC. This one here is covered in a thick layer of grime, but we'll come across that later on. Giving this engine a quick battery test, it is a runner, although it's a very stuttery runner. And I don't know when this loco, or if indeed it has ever been serviced. So we're going to strip it down and have a look at it. And I am going to fit a digital decoder on it later on. Although, ignore what you see on the screen now, I don't actually fit an AE Models decoder to this in the end. I end up using a TCS decoder. To remove the body shell on these locos, you need to remove these two screws in the battery boxes. And then the loco just unclips from the chassis. So removing these two screws, I put them in the magnetic tray out the way for safekeeping. And then the body is a simple unclip affair, which reveals a very simple chassis setup of two pickup wires directly to the brushes. No fancy electronics in this model. This should make it easier to convert to digital later on. As I mentioned, I'm going to be doing two of these, and I've actually picked up a BR Blue version, which has got some body shell damage. And this one I'm actually going to give to my dad when we've repaired it. But for the main focus of this Trash to Track, we'll be focusing on the green version. So we'll set the blue one to the back, and we'll have a look at my version, which I'll be keeping to run on the outside railway. As I said, the wiring on this model is very simple. Two wires from pickup to the brushes. To remove the bogies, you just have to remove this retaining screw from the rear there, and then slide the bogie forward out of the clips, and it just drops away. I'm going to cut the wires because, as I said, we're going to be rewiring this model anyway. So I'm just going to cut them there off the pickup bogie, which is dropped out using two screws, one at the back and one in the middle. And there's the chassis block, some nice 1980s sellotape there. To remove the motor block from the bogie frame, you have to simply put a screwdriver in the back here and release this clip. There are also two clips midway along the bogie that clip onto the motor mount. And looking at the marks there, I'm not the first person to have this apart. Now, what surprises me when I take this model apart is the armature there. Now, Triang's 31 is a 3-pole motor. The Airfix one is a 5-pole motor, which should aid in its running when we fit this with digital. To remove the brushes, you remove this isolated plate here with this screw. The brush spring and everything falls out. The brushes there are non-standard. They're standard for Airfix, but they're a non-standard shape in general. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the magnet retainer here so I know which goes where. Marking the front of the bogie casing, and I'm also going to draw a line on the magnet so that I know it goes back in the correct way. Some may wonder why I'm doing this, but it will save me a headache later on when I come to reassemble the model and the magnet. Now, to remove the magnet and its keepers, you remove that screw. I was actually looking for a nut on the other end there, but there actually isn't one. It is threaded into that silver retainer. And these are a simple slide out of a die-cast retaining clip. That needs some cleaning, as there's a lot of carbon build-up all over the magnet and these retainers. And once they've been removed, the armature just simply falls out. And as I said, I was very surprised to see that these are a 5-pole motor. So I'm going to use my usual method now of cleaning the commutator up. Firstly, I'm going to give it a polish with some methylated spirits and a cotton bud. I'm also going to clean this chassis block, motor block here, as you can see on that cotton bud, there is a lot of carbon and dirt build-up on this model. This model, looking at the wear on it, has got some mileage on it. So as I said, I'm going to clean up the commutator by first polishing it off with cotton bud and methylated spirits. Then I'm going to polish it over a damp cloth with a fiberglass pencil. The damp cloth ensures that any stray fibres are collected in the dampness and not on my workbench and into my fingers. And then I'm going to clean out the gaps in the commutator with a shaved down toothpick, as a build-up of carbon between these plates can cause short circuits and very poor running. So once that's all cleaned and done, I just polish it off there finally with a cotton bud and meths. I also clean the motor shafts and the worm gears on each end, as there is signs of the old lubrication still present, which has gone hard and sticky. The bogie frame is also given a good clean up, as there's quite a lot of carbon and dirt build up at the bottom here, as you can see on that cotton bud there. And off camera I gave these a spray with the contact cleaner, as I did the motor housing die-cast block. The wheels, although they're non-conductive on the driving bogie, they are plastic. These are thoroughly cleaned, as I don't want to be spreading any dirt onto my track when this is running. So I clean the treads with a bit of methylated spirits on a cotton bud. And I also remove the traction tyres and clean all around those and replace the traction tyres. And you can see there just how much dirt is on this model. And the wheel centres are also cleaned, as there was fluff and whatever else built up. There are some carpet fibres, as can be expected from a model from the 1980s. There are some carbon fibres. There are some carpet fibres around the axles. I removed the traction tyre there with the aid of a cotton bud, and I will assess the traction tyres, as they seem to be in very good condition on the green model, so I may reuse them by turning them inside out. Real life tyre turning happens on real locos, and it has also happened on this model. Yet more fibres are pulled off the axle there with my tweezer nose pliers, just to ensure that they are perfectly clean when I reassemble the model later on. Now that that's all done, I'm going to turn my attention to the non-driving pickup bogie, and this picks up from all 6 wheels. So I'm going to remove the pickup piece by removing these 2 screws on here, and then I'm going to give this a thorough clean over, as I need this to be absolutely spotlessly clean for very reliable DCC running. You can see there is actually a build-up of dirt on each of these pickups. I'm also going to remove this bogie frame from the wheel housing there, just to thoroughly clean everything. This also has these plastic clips, so all told there are 6 clips to hold each bogie frame on, which does seem a little bit overkill for a model of this sort, but eventually when all the clips are released, the retaining piece of the wheels comes away and the wheels are free to be cleaned, as is the bogie frame. Although unlike the frame at the motor end, this one doesn't have any carbon buildup and only requires a light dusting with an old paintbrush. As I said, all of the wheels on the non-driving bogie pick up electricity, so these were given a thorough clean and polish with a cotton bud and methylated spirits, and some of the more tarnished ones were given a polish with the fiberglass pencil. The wheel backs were also cleaned. These were polished with fiberglass pencil and then cleaned again with a cotton bud and meths, just to make sure good electrical conductivity for when this model is running. Again, you'll see me working over a dampened cloth, and this really does help arrest all the stray fibres from the fiberglass pencil and stops them getting into your fingers, which is, for something so small, is extremely painful. As I said, these were all polished up, as were the wheel backs. And then once I'd finished with the fiberglass pencil, I also gave them another quick rub down with a cotton bud and mess, just to remove any stray fibres and any leftover detritus that was on the wheels. And as you can see there, they are positively gleaming. So hopefully this will ensure good running when we reassemble the model. The actual die-cast block, which retains the wheels, was also given a thorough cleaning, as there was some old lubrication that had gone funny on the axle bits there, and there's also a brass spring part there that also needed cleaning, although when I did try and clean this, it actually popped off its rivet, so had to be refitted with the aid of a screwdriver and some needle nose pliers. I just try and bend it back into place there gently and it pops off onto my hand. So looking at it, I'm going to bend it back into place, and then, like I said, just push it back on with the aid of my tweezer nose pliers and the flat bladed screwdriver. This ensures that the centre wheel is always pushing down on the rail, collecting electricity. The pickups themselves were cleaned with a cotton bud of methylated spirits, and then with the aid of my scalpel handle I pressed the brass parts against them and then polished them up. I couldn't find a better way of doing this because I didn't want to bend them out of shape, so I just held the scalpel handle with one hand and polished them all up with the other. Before reassembling, I'm going to put a very small amount of oil on these axle parts here. There are no bearings on this model, it is just metal axles on the die casting. And as the axles themselves don't pick any electric up, you can get away with using non-conductive oil on those. Just do not get any on the wheel backs. There you can see that centre wheel balancing on that spring piece as I mentioned earlier. Now to reassemble the bogie, there's 2 pins that go in the front. Locate those and then the rest of it just clips down into place, ensuring that all of the other 5 clips have engaged correctly, and then we can refit the pickup piece. Refitting the pickup part was easier said than done, as you'd end up getting 5 of the 6 brass strips in place and then another one would just pop out of its location. So it took a little bit of patience getting this bit back into place correctly. And as I said there, you can see I'm just trying to hold them all in place, but one other would then pop out. So with the aid of the flat bladed screwdriver, I just eventually get it all into place and re-secure it with the 2 small brass screws we removed earlier. I've also took the liberty of removing that capacitor off those soldered tabs there, as that is not needed for DCC running. I reattached the original pickup wires to the 2 original solder tabs, as there's no need to replace this wire as there's nothing wrong with it. And I've just stripped the old ends off there and then re-tinned the wire. And then you get the chassis part, and the wires fit through the 2 holes that are moulded into this. This was given a quick dust over with the paintbrush to remove any fibres and dust that were there. And then, as I said, the pickup wires thread through pre-cast holes, and then the bogie is lined up with the 2 screw holes that secure it in place. The middle screw has a small washer and then a small Phillips screw, and then that retaining screw goes in the back of the bogie there, and that is the pickup bogie completely overhauled and ready for service. Now to rebuild the motor block, the armature here only goes in a certain way, as there are flat parts cast into that brass bearing, so these have to go in a certain way with the flat part to the side to allow the armature to sit in place correctly. Before I put it back in, I'm just going to put a small amount of oil on those brass bearings so that the motor is correctly lubricated for when it's spinning. And then once it's back in place, I will also put some silicone on the worm gear. I'm just trying to highlight there the flat part of those bearings, as they face to the left hand side on each end. So if you look at it from the windings, they face the left hand end, and then it spins nicely in the cradle there. So as I said, just a small amount of silicone grease on the worm gears there, because again they're metal gears on they're metal and the gears on the wheels are plastic, so they do need to have correct lubrication, otherwise it will wear the plastic down. And then you'll just have to excuse the shoddy film in there, but I've got the traction tyres back, and these were refitted onto the wheels the opposite way round to what I took them off. As I said, these were still very springy, the rubber hadn't gone funny, so I'm going to reuse them for now. The wheels are then put back in place. These again are not in any sort of bearings, they just sit in the die casting there. And again, a small amount of grease was placed on these plastic cogs, as like I've just said, it can wear out if they're not correctly lubricated. And a small amount of oil was also put on the axle holders there to ensure that we don't wear anything out unnecessarily. Once that's all back in place, I gently flip it over to sit on its wheels, and we're going to reassemble the magnet housing. This goes in again, as I said earlier on, I mark them left, right and mark the magnet so it goes back in correctly. This magnet has been remagnetised, as whilst filming this I actually purchased a remagnetiser for myself, but I'll show you that in an upcoming video. And then the right hand piece is put in. The lines on the magnet are lined up with those on the housing, and the retaining bolt is screwed back into place. That just slides through there and through the magnet, and was gently tightened up with a flat bladed screwdriver. Now that has all been redone, I'm going to refit this insulated piece here, ready to put the brushes back in. And then the brush spring itself, I actually insulated both sides with some very small heat shrink tubing. As like I said, this is going to be digital, so you need to ensure that it's insulated correctly. And using the heat shrink tubing proves a very good way of providing insulation on the brushes. And it's also easy to work with, as it shrinks down to the metal and holds itself firm. Now I'm going to reassemble this back with the screw again. I'm just having a look at some of the detail on the bogie there, and it is interesting to note actually, before I go on to the brushes, that both Airfix and Triang decided to cast the middle wheel on the drive bogie as a dummy. That I don't know why they didn't just put a wheel in there as a dummy floating wheel. Maybe it was something to do with having to get to negotiate first radius train set curves. But anyway, the bogie was put back in first again using the two locating tabs in the front, and then it was clipped back into place. Now the brushes I did find slightly difficult to get back in at this point. I should have put the brushes back in before the bogie plate, as it was a very fiddly job trying to squeeze this between the bogie plate and the armature there. This took an absolute age to try and fit in, and it was only after I'd done it that I realised it became so fiddly because of that bogie frame being in the way. So if you take an Airfix 31 apart, do not follow my example and put the brushes in before you put the bogie plate back on. But anyway, we got there in the end. So that's the motor completely rebuilt and fully serviced and cleaned up. So I'm going to just sit it on here with the dummy wheel sat in the meths tub, and I'm going to apply some power to it just to make sure that it's running nicely. And although it's not exactly evident in this shot, the motor was running really nicely, if not a little bit noisy, but that is usual for this type of motor and this age of loco. So once I'd run it in a little bit, get that grease all spread through the drivetrain, and I was happy, I'm going to now refit this to that chassis block. And as I said before, to do this, you just put it in slightly forwards, and there are plastic lugs there that slide onto the die casting, and then it is secured with this brass screw in the back. And that is the chassis rebuilt and ready for me to fit a TCS decoder to later on. But now we've got the majority of the work done, I'm going to turn my attention to the body shell of my 31. Because for some reason somebody has put the Silcock Express transfers on the side of it, which I believe originally came off a Class 47. And the body shell could do with a clean, so using a cotton bud and some warm water, I just clean all the glazing up there, and as you can see, the dust and yellowing has all come off with the cotton bud. And then to remove the transfer, what I initially did was I initially soaked the transfer with hot water, hoping that it would release itself, which it didn't. So trying to scrub it here with cold water actually didn't help anything. So I then try and start removing it with a blunted cocktail stick, and this had some effect. It did start to lift some of the transfer, but again, it wasn't really working fast enough. And I really don't want to repaint this entire model, as that would put the rebuild back at least 3 or 4 days. So what I do then is I use a bit of methylated spirits on a cotton bud and work gently so as not to try and ruin the green paint underneath. And to my surprise, it has lifted the majority of the transfer off. So then what I did was I've got a very blunt scalpel blade that's been rocking around in my toolbox. So refitting it to my handle, I just gently, and I mean very, very gently, just scrape off the remainder of this transfer. And working steadily, as you can see here with this footage that I've sped up, working carefully, I actually scrape the remainder of the transfer away, leaving minimal damage to the green paint underneath. Now this whole process took about 25 minutes, so that's nearly an hour working on the body shell to remove the 2 transfers. But it was worth it in the end, as this 31 I want in 1959 condition as much as I can. So there we go, just wiping it off there with my cotton bud soaked in warm water, and you can see there that most of the transfer has been removed. After some more scraping, I've removed it completely. Just going to dust off the excess there, and you can see where it was, the actual bodywork has gone slightly shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to patch that up and brush paint it with some Rail Match BR Green after I've removed that transfer. To my surprise, the Rail Match BR Green that I painted on this body shell was an almost exact match to the Airfix colour, proving that Airfix had actually got some things right when they manufactured model railways. As I said, this 31 is very well detailed for its age. The grills are very good, they're very detailed and quite defined, as is the ends, but it is let down with its buffer beam and lack of detail on the buffer beam. Some people may frown at using a brush and ask why I didn't mask up and airbrush this, but I didn't want to fire up the airbrush for what turned out to be a 15-minute paint job. And as you'll see when I'm finished, you can't actually see any brush marks in it at all, and it really has repaired the body sides quite nicely. I'm not going to touch up any of that damage on the roof there, as it looks like weathering, and I will one day when I do fire the airbrush up, I will weather the roof of this model. So yeah, that Rail Match BR Green is a very good match for Airfix's green. Now, to fit a decoder to this model, like I said here, you can see me fitting an AE Models decoder, but I ended up fitting a TCS one, which allowed the model to run really sweet. The golden rule I always follow is red and black to track and orange and grey the other way. So the orange and grey wires were soldered directly to the brushes themselves, and the red and black wires were soldered to one pickup wire each respectively, and that is as simple as it gets for DCC fitment. There's no lights or sound in this model. And it was a 5-minute job fitting a decoder. Just remember that when you solder the pickup wires together, to put some heat shrink tubing on the pickup wire first, and then slide that over the join so that there's no danger of any short circuits when this model is reassembled, especially with that large metal chassis weight that you can see there. So now that's all in place, I'm just going to give it a quick battery test with the AE Models decoder, and you can see that the chassis is running nicely, if not a bit slowly, and that's because my battery is fast running out of power. But applying power direct to the wheels, you can see the drive wheels there are spinning. The reason I swapped to a TCS T1 decoder was the fact that the TCS decoders have automatic back EMF functions on them, and it allowed the model to run nicer. The AE Models decoder, the model at higher speeds became very jerky, so I changed it for a TCS decoder, and that was the same with the blue 31 that I'll do for my dad as well. The AE Models decoders were removed and kept in my spares box for later on. The decoder you can see there was taped down, but you must ensure that the two holes are clear where the screws go. I'm just highlighting here some detail painting I did. I painted the tail lights red, and I also removed the old head codes and painted them black, ready for some transfers later on. I placed the transfers on individually, and these came from Railtech. The body shell was then clipped back into place, and these two retaining screws were secured. Again, don't over tighten your screws because you will break the plastic on these Airfix 31s, as the plastic is quite soft. And in fact, on the blue 31, it had already been threaded by somebody over tightening it in the past. And that is the green 31, all but done. It only needs its head codes doing, as I said, but I will do that shortly when I put some transfers on my dad's model. The BR Blue 31 was done exactly the same way. So all I've got here is some footage of me taking it apart, just to ensure that the interior is the same. As these models are second hand, you don't really know what you're getting yourself into, and I could have opened this up to find a digital decoder already in it, but as it happens, it was exactly the same as my green version. As I said, there's some cosmetic damage here, and I'm going to have to rebuild that buffer beam shank. The one thing I didn't like about the blue 31 was the fact that the blue and yellow paint extends too far down the buffer beam cowls, and these should be black. So going through my spares here, I find two replacement buffers, which are an exact fit. And unfortunately, the footage of me repairing the buffer beam was lost. So I'll run through it with some still pictures. Basically, the damage there on the buffer beam was opened up with a round rat tail file. There you can see there, I'm just opening the hole up. Then a plastic tube was inserted. In this case, it was off an old plastic cotton bud. As when cotton buds had plastic tubes, I did keep a load of them for this very purpose. This was glued in place with some plastic weld cement. And then after it had thoroughly dried, it was cut down to length, and the buffer beam was rebuilt using some model filler from Humbro. It was sanded down and then all was painted up to look nice again. As you will see here, the Blue 31 has been overhauled and digitally fitted, and I will now show you the repaired buffer beam. And I hope you'll agree that painting that buffer beam black really has changed the appearance of this Airfix 31. I really don't know why Airfix didn't do this in the factory. Maybe it was a cost cutting error, but it shouldn't have blue and yellow buffer cowls, and it really does look quite nice now. And again, I painted the tail lights red, but in this one, because the head codes actually showed a class 1 service, I left them in place. And again, as before, body shell was clipped on and the 2 retaining screws were put back in, although like I said, one of the screws actually doesn't secure anymore because it's been threaded. During that time, I've now completed the head codes on my 31. One is an express class 1 train on that end, 1 Echo 79, and on the other is a class 8 freight train, 8 Alpha 46, which is a freight bound for London. So yeah, I'm not too disimpressed with these models. The green one and the blue one, they really do look quite nice with a little bit of work. They're never going to stand up to Hornby's modern 31s with lights and sound, but for a budget loco that takes only a little bit of work to get looking well, and they come pre-fitted with Airfix's version of an NEM coupling, I think they stand up quite well, even though they are 30-40 years old. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. The email address was just on your screen, and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, and who knows, it may feature in an episode all of its own. I'm going to leave you now with a couple of shots of the 31s running around the garden, my green one on a London-bound freight train, and my dad's one on a roke of Airfix Mark II coaches, which again, don't look too bad considering their age. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Trash to Track. Thanks again for the continued support I get for the videos. I really do appreciate it, and I do read all of your comments. Like I said, even though the 31s are quite loud, I think they've stood the test of time really well. Thanks again for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.